for joining us either this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are today. As I get started, I'd really like you all to just try to imagine an 80,000 head feedlot and slaughterhouse are slated for yet another expansion across the road from your home. Or a poultry operation is scheduled to expand from 200,000 laying hens to 1 million hens. A CAFO owner announces plans to add a factory farm biogas and waste facility to a 6,200 head dairy farm. Or a wholesale beef packing company applies for a permit to dump 350,000 gallons of waste into a nearby river. These are the kinds of cases that the team at Socially Responsible Agriculture Project, or what we call lovingly SRAP, sees every day. I'm Sherry Duggar. I'm the Executive Director of SRAP, and I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us this week for our 2024 SRAP Live Summit, which is focused on building a socially responsible food future. We hope this event will offer you a variety of perspectives from community members, experts, organizational allies, and journalists to help you better understand the harms of our current industrial agriculture system, as well as how best to advocate for an improved, socially responsible food future. Before I came to work in the food and agriculture space, I was a journalist. I was editing various publications that were distributed throughout my home state of Indiana. One of those publications was called Farm Indiana. It was through stories in that publication that I came to learn about and better understand our modern day food and agriculture system, as well as its direct and unfortunately harmful impacts on all of our lives. At the same time as I was reading, writing, and editing stories, I was building out a small farm and business in Shelby County, Indiana, on a small 3-acre plot of land that was surrounded by fields of corn and soybeans. As I learned, I became increasingly biased about the stories I wanted to showcase in the publication. I wanted to feature independent family farms, local food systems, and sustainable agriculture. I wanted to support public health, quality of life, animal welfare, thriving rural communities, and ultimately planetary well-being. I didn't want to profile or showcase corporate agriculture. It was because of what I learned in those early days and also what I couldn't then unlearn about our food system that launched me into becoming an outspoken advocate and leaving my journalism career to work in the food and agriculture space. It is because of those stories, those voices, and those lived experiences that I sit here before you today. As I launched my new career, I spent years learning from other advocates, farmers, and newfound friends. What they taught me was this: with industrial livestock production comes injustice to the environment, to people, to animals, and to the planet. I began to quickly understand how today's consolidated food and agriculture system drives independent family farmers off the land. It abuses food system workers. It perpetuates social and racial injustices. It pollutes our air and water, exacerbates climate change, compromises animal welfare, extracts wealth from your rural communities, and damages public health. It wasn't long before I fully realized that corporate giants were the only ones benefiting from our current industrial agriculture system. 4 corporations, Tyson, Smithfield, JBS, and Cargill, collectively control more than 80% of U.S. beef, pork, and poultry production. Monopolization of the marketplace gives these companies the power to do so much harm. They can exploit farmers by keeping their prices low. They can exploit workers by paying low wages. They can sell nutritionally inferior drug and pesticide contaminated food. They extract wealth from local communities. There's so many more things that go wrong with this system. We have to change our course, and we must act quickly. We truly have no other choice. Policies must prioritize regenerative agriculture and the restoration of degraded land. Subsidies must be redirected from industrial to sustainable and regenerative agriculture into the production of real food, fruits, vegetables, and pasture-raised proteins to feed us healthfully. Consumers can demand more of producers, and we have to hold governments and corporations to account. It takes all of us to create real change. As I've met farmers around the country growing food for their communities, I've come to see very clearly that these farmers are resourceful, smart, and resilient people. They will raise food and produce food in the ways that they are incentivized to do so. Our government policies then offer the fastest and most effective way to encourage and incentivize sustainable and regenerative agriculture. If we assist them in doing it, they'll do it. But creating large-scale change, though desperately needed, is difficult and slow. We know this. We often hear advocates in the space talking about moving the needle rather than calling for large-scale food system reform. Some days that feels frustrating. Other days it inspires me to keep going, to keep talking, to keep pushing for the food system I truly believe we all deserve. Until we see massive policy change in this country to support a socially responsible agriculture system, SRAP remains committed to helping communities protect themselves from the devastating public health, environmental, and socioeconomic damages caused by industrial livestock production. For more than 20 years, we've been doing this. Our team has worked throughout the U.S. to provide free assistance to any community that requests our support when facing the threats posed by factory farms. SRAP's community support team includes technical experts, independent farmers, and rural residents who, like the communities we serve, have experienced the impacts of industrial livestock production firsthand. We offer technical and strategic support to help people educate and mobilize their communities, navigate regulatory processes, engage lawmakers, publicize their stories, and ultimately build coalitions to reject harmful industrial agricultural practices and advocate for a socially responsible food future. We also have other programming. Community members may come to us when they're facing an incoming operation, but they stay with us through the Food and Farm Network, where they can develop their leadership skills, learn how to negotiate the policy process, engage with other networks and coalitions, and effectively advocate for replacing industrial livestock production with ecologically sound, socially equitable, and economically viable animal agriculture. Our Water Rangers program works with rural communities to protect their right to clean water and hold industrial livestock operations accountable for pollution. Concentrated animal feeding operations, or what we refer to as CAFOs, and other industrial livestock operations are among the worst water polluters in the U.S. Our Water Rangers program provides free water testing, training, and offers community members instructions on documenting and reporting pollution violations to local, state, tribal, nations, and federal regulators. Rural communities, farm workers, public health, the environment, and animals, they're all harmed by industrial agriculture. What you might not know is that production contract farmers who operate these CAFOs can suffer too. Through our contract grower transition program, SRAP attempts to further transform rural communities by engaging contract growers who are struggling within the industrial agriculture system and getting them out of that system, helping them to exit the industry and providing resources to prevent others from becoming trapped within that system. We have a great deal of work to do. Some of our efforts are not successful, oftentimes they are. Over the past year, SRAP has handled more than 40 new community support help requests for assistance in 19 states. We've seen many successes, including supporting a community in Steuben County, Indiana, to prevent an 8,000 head cattle CAFO, and helping the community of Lintown, Wisconsin, deny a comprehensive plan amendment and zoning changes that would have allowed for the construction of a polluting biogas digester. And that's not all. Our contract grower transition program has celebrated an amazing win when a former grower had over $1 million in debt paid off by a USDA program, which saved his generational family land from foreclosure. Our Water Rangers program worked with a community group on their water monitoring, which resulted in a 5,000 head hog CAFO receiving violations for the pollution it caused. The EPA accepted a civil rights complaint filed by SRAP and others and agreed to investigate a permit process for a proposed factory farm biogas facility in Seaford, Delaware. These stories of success of rural residents fighting to protect and safeguard their communities and lives keep coming. Though the damages of industrial livestock production are disheartening, we know that a different approach to agriculture is entirely possible. Today, we'll feature two panel discussions. The first will be on factory farm biogas, which has seen explosive investment and growth in recent years. We'll also be highlighting new state legislation that aims to prop up the industrial livestock system, and we'll talk a lot about how advocates are beating back the powerful big ag lobby. Tomorrow, we're going to again feature two discussion panels, one on the data that can help to tell compelling stories about the harms that we face. We'll also host a discussion on collaborating to amplify voices and messages that are critical to achieving large-scale food system change. Lastly, I'm really excited to announce that we'll offer a keynote address by SRAP board member Austin Frerick, who recently published a book, which I'm sure he'll talk about the food industry tomorrow in our keynote address that will cap off the two-day event. I hope you'll enjoy what you hear today. I hope you'll also find that, unlike me, you can't unlearn what you hear over these next 2 days. May the knowledge that you pull from this event inspire and motivate you to join forces in advocating for, supporting, and building a just and resilient, socially responsible agriculture system. It takes us all to create real and lasting change. If you haven't yet, please also register to attend day 2 of our event. Join us tomorrow morning for conversation and coffee, and visit SRAP's website at sraproject.org to learn more about how you can get involved in all the work we do and to stay in touch. So thank you. And with that, I'll pass the virtual microphone over to Cole Dickerson, who I believe is going to lead us in a short activity.
Yes, thank you so much, Sherry. And thank you everyone for being here and bearing with us. So we're really excited to be putting this event on. So I'm here to welcome everyone to this virtual space. We wish we could be doing this event in person, but we wanted to make sure everyone could be here. So we're here virtually, but I want to lead a quick activity to help us get connected to one another, to help us learn a little more about where people are calling in from. I'm going to pivot to just using the chat since it seems like I don't want to add any more technical difficulties to the table. So I'm going to put a couple questions into the chat, and if everyone can respond, what state do you live in, or what state are you calling in from? We'd love to hear, where people are around the country. Great. It looks like we got some responses so far. I'm seeing Southwest, Midwest, on the East Coast. I'm here in Boulder, Colorado. Any Colorado love out there? Awesome. Yeah, Julia. This is so great to see people from all over, and that's a testament to the work we do. We work nationwide, anywhere communities need support in their fight to hold CAFOs and the industrial agriculture system accountable for pollution and the other negative impacts that are often caused from that system. So that's so great to see all of y'all are here and hear from so many diverse places. So the next question, do you live in a rural, urban, or suburban area? I'm curious. So rural and urban are two relatively easy things to define. If anyone doesn't know if they fit in rural or urban, suburban is an option that, in my mind is, if you don't think you're in a city, but you don't think you're in the country, you're in a suburban area. Great. So it looks like we got people from all over again, which is really great to see. Rural, lots of rural folks, lots of urban folks, some suburban folks. That is awesome. And I'll say SRAP, we work with a lot of rural communities, but we also work with a lot of communities that are closer to cities and organizations that do really awesome work in urban areas. So next question. How do you participate in the food system? So this is a pretty open-ended question. Feel free to respond however you would like. Me, I'm an eater. I eat food. That's probably the biggest way I interact in the food system, aside from my work with the Water Rangers program. But you might be a farmer. You might be a policy advocate. You might do work in a grocery store, something like that. We're all participants in this food system, and it's really cool to see the wide gamut of participation in food systems. Policy advocate, eater of food, passionate strawberry and basil gardener, love it. Retired organic dairy, educator, policy advocate. Wow, I love seeing how many people are here and how many different experiences we have. This is so great. It's an awesome kickoff to the event. Next question. You all are amazing. How are you impacted by industrial agriculture? Do you live near CAFO? For anyone who may be unfamiliar, that's a concentrated animal feeding operation. They're big facilities that house thousands and tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of animals. Do you own a farm that's impacted? Are your food choices influenced? It could be a number of reasons. I think it's fair to say we're all impacted in some way because the industrial agriculture system is so widespread in our daily lives. Raised grass-fed beef, that's really awesome. CAFO borders my farm from Kevin. Green water. live near CAFOs. I was trapped as an ex-industrial livestock producer. So we have people who are impacted in so many different ways, which is an important thing to recognize. And then finally, what are you hoping to take away from SRAP Live, building a socially responsible food future? So we have a really great schedule in the next couple of days. Following me will be a panel on biogas, factory farm gas. Maybe you're interested in networking with other people here. We have a really great coffee break tomorrow. I believe that is at 1 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. We're going to be talking through issues, meeting people. So please join that if you're interested there. Let's see, connections, information, how to kick ass and take names. Love it, Kevin. That's awesome. That's what I hope to take away too. Growing network, learn a lot of stuff, facts. This is great. This helps us understand what you all are interested in learning. And it's a really good bow to tie on this exercise, hearing what people are looking forward to. I think it's important to stay positive in this fight. And I'm feeling a lot of that from the chat. People are really excited to learn and to take action. So that's really great to see. I believe my time is up. So thank you all for participating in the exercise, getting us going. I'm really excited for the next couple of days and really excited to see how many people showed up for this important work. So Sherry, I'll turn it back over to you, and everyone, please stay active in the chat. If you have more thoughts on these questions, feel free to keep responding.
Absolutely. And while these discussions are going, if you want to go ahead and put questions about the discussions in the chat as well, please feel free to contribute those questions, and we'll get as many things answered as we can as we go. So the next, or the first panel, I should say, is going to be on factory farm gas. We have an amazing moderator for this discussion, somebody that we've worked with on our own report that we just put out with Friends of the Earth here recently. We were super stoked to be able to contribute to that report and be asked by Friends of the Earth, who we respect greatly, to be able to work with them and partner on this effort. Chloe Waterman was a huge took on a huge role in that, in us producing that report with them. So she currently serves as a senior program manager for Friends of the Earth, their climate-friendly food program, where she leads Friends of the Earth's policy and markets campaign to advance a healthy and climate-friendly food system. On Capitol Hill and state houses and across city governments, she's pioneered climate-friendly food procurement policies, initiatives to expand plant-based school meal offerings, and other policies to build a just and sustainable food system. Chloe currently resides in Prince George's County, Maryland, where she serves as a co-chair for the Prince George's County Food Equity Council. So Chloe, I'm going to let you take it over, and thank you so much for moderating this first panel discussion.
My pleasure. Well, thank you so much, Sherry, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for being here. It was such an honor to me to be invited to moderate this panel of amazing experts that you'll hear from soon, but also to be invited by SRAP, who I just have so much admiration for. I think that the work that SRAP is doing is just about the most important work to be done in our movement. And I know that that strength partly comes from the amazing SRAP staff, but also the SRAP network, which is all of you guys. So just thanks so much for letting me be part of this. So before we jump into the panel and I introduce our panelists, Sherry mentioned this panel is about manure biogas. And I know some of you probably know more than you ever wish to know about manure biogas already, but want to be cognizant that some of you may be newer to the subject as well. So I'm going to start with just a couple minutes explaining what manure biogas is and why we're so worried about it. So one way to think about biogas is as a child of the marriage between fossil fuels and factory farms. So these two industries got together, they teamed up to figure out a scheme for greenwashing both of their polluting business models and figuring out a way to profit from their pollution in the form of biogas. The more technical way of explaining biogas is to say that it's a mixture of gases created through anaerobic digestion. Anaerobic digestion is a process where bacteria break down organic material, in this case, animal waste, in a closed oxygen-free environment known as a digester. And what's left behind from bacteria eating the waste is a combination of gases, primarily methane and carbon dioxide. So it's not dissimilar than to fracked gas, as well as it has a solid and liquid material called digestate or effluent. And you'll hear more about that from our speakers. So this strategy of producing biogas, or we call it factory farm gas, is a more accurate name. Biogas is kind of the industry's greenwash name. It's the cornerstone of the Biden administration's methane reduction plan for the agriculture sector. And unfortunately, the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill infuse billions of dollars into programs and tax incentives that can be used to support factory farm gas production. So the stakes for this strategy of factory farm gas to work are very high. As you all know here, the world is on track to reach a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature this century, which will have catastrophic impacts, including for our food and agriculture sector. Rapidly reducing those emissions, methane, again, is this short-lived greenhouse gas with the global warming potential 80 times higher than carbon dioxide. It's a crucial part of the pathway to limit global temperature increases, and animal agriculture is the largest source of methane emissions in the US. But as you'll hear from our speakers today, producing manure biogas is not the solution. Factory farm gas will further entrench the inherently unsustainable and unjust systems of industrial animal agriculture and fossil fuel energy for decades to come. Factory farm gas even creates new threats for communities living near factory farms, including more ammonia emissions, more concentrated nutrients and digestate that harm water quality, new pipelines and fossil fuel infrastructure. And while this is all done in the name of reducing methane emissions, the report that Sherry mentioned that Friends of the Earth and SRAP put out a couple months ago found that methane reduction benefits for manure biogas have been considerably overstated by the US government. They're not adequately tracked, and they're not sufficient to meet climate targets. So I will put a link to our report that we encourage you all to check out. There's also a link on that landing page to a webinar that we put on if you're interested in more about that research. But for now, I want to turn it over to our incredible panel that we have for today. So our first panelist is Kim Dupre. She is the community leader and advocate with Sustain Rural Wisconsin Network. We'll have Samantha Krop, Neuse Riverkeeper and Director of Advocacy for Sound Rivers in North Carolina. Keith Schneider, who is the Senior Editor for Circle of Blue and has written for New York Times, The Guardian, The New Lead, and other publications. And then Patty Lovera, who's a policy advisor for the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment. So Kim is going to go first. Kim is a farmer's daughter who in 2001 found herself near a dairy CAFO and biogas digester in rural Wisconsin. Her experience turned her into an advocate for clean water, extending her reach beyond her local community to protect public health and safety. Her involvement in speaking out against 10 biogas proposals over the past 20 plus years has taught her the importance of data and community activism. Kim, we know you've been doing a lot of work to help communities organize around digester projects in Wisconsin, beyond. Tell us more about how you got involved in this these are the earlier days of digesters, right? Back in 2001, and what communities that you're working with are experiencing.
Well, I started off in Emerald, Wisconsin, which is in the St. Croix River watershed. That's northwestern Wisconsin and eastern Minnesota area. And Emerald was a local guy back in 2001 who just he was building a new dairy farm from the ground up, was going to do this whole biogas thing, put in a plant to do all that, and ship it to a pipeline in about 10 miles away. And that was about 1.5 miles from my house at the time. And I remember sitting through those town hall meetings. Everybody was on board with this. He'd done his homework and got the DNR on board. He got the county board people, all the big members in the community, and everything was going to be wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And this was going to be a starship of the north of dairying in Wisconsin. And it was all wins and no losses. That's how they sold it. Well, it didn't turn out quite that way. A couple of years later, the whole plant exploded and burned up, and they never really used the digester again and went back to routinely spreading the manure around the fields as they had always done. So that's kind of what got me the whole thing. I got acquainted with that whole system back then, but obviously with the tax monies that's been pushed out there's been a lot more attention focused on biogas. So I'll share my screen here with you momentarily. If I can find what I'm doing here. All right, I hope you can see that. Now,
We can see it.
all right. So for the past, mainly the past 5 years, these are some of the locations of folks that have reached out to me and given me a call and wanting to know my expertise or my experience mainly, just living next to a biogas digester and what we experienced in Emerald. And the big thing with the Emerald Town Hall is the well. It's located right across the road from where Emerald Dairy is, and the nitrates in that well are running consistently in the 30s and 40s now. And when that well was first built in 2007, they built that from the ground up too. The nitrates were only at 6.9. So in about 15 years time, the nitrates have just skyrocketed. And so that star is the one and the very right above Menominee, kind of like the top right over there. So that's where Emerald all started. And then as folks reached out to me, we had Nature Energy trying to come into Roberts, Wisconsin. There was one in Pleasant Valley, which is right next to the 2 stars next to Menominee. We had another one up in New Richmond. All Nature Energy was trying every couple of years, it would try a different location and try to find a different spot that it could land. Vanguard Renewables was the one that is in Wapaka. You'll see there. You'll also see the 2 stars underneath the Hudson one, just east of the Twin Cities. Those are the two. One was Bigadan and the other one was Vanguard Renewables. So we've had 3 different companies trying to get into Wisconsin. I also helped some folks in Painesville, Minnesota about the same time, and Lewiston, Minnesota, which is the star down by Rochester, as well as the group that had just reached out to me via Facebook Messenger in Pelham, Tennessee, who found online that I had made a lot of comments about biogas, and they called me up and said, what can you do to help us? So I've gotten around a little bit, let's put it that way, and my experience here. So to give you a 55,000 foot view of all this, how do we activate the community once we know a proposal is on the table? And that's the catch. We often don't know until I get that call and it's like, we're having a meeting next week. What am I going to do? And so this is how we get people started. First off, you have to engage your local officials, whether that's your county board, town board, city council, whoever it is that you're dealing with. You need to get in touch with them and start talking to them, because in our experience is those officials usually are there for a long time and they like to keep their chair. They don't want to lose that chair. So if they understand that the public is really feeling one way or another about this proposal, they're going to follow the public's lead. But you need to be persistent about it, because what you don't realize is that the biogas company has probably already been talking to them for a year or so, or the local farmer that they're trying to partner with. And you need to get with your local officials and get your opinions expressed and your questions asked and make sure they get answers. And that's been very effective for us, these 15 FAQs that the ladies in Wapaka started a website that put all those out there, very easy for all of you to get access to. And I actually got this list of questions from Lee Luft, who was the chair of the groundwater task force in Kewaunee County, when they were looking at a state finance digester back in 2017, I think, or something like that, 2016, 2017. And so he was a paper mill executive, so he knew his business and he knew what questions to ask, because they had to go through the whole process in the paper industry of cleaning up their water and cleaning up their industry. And so he had a great list of questions that I always share with the community, saying, because we don't know what we don't know. Most of us had no idea about biogas. And so if you don't even know what to ask, you don't even know what the concerns could be. And so this list of questions was very helpful. We also have a fact sheet that I call her Dr. Sarah Delfino had made up for us. She did her research paper on biogas and CAFOs in Wisconsin. That was dissertation done back in June. And so she has amazing information that we put out there so that people, again, have some data to back up the questions that they need to ask. And other things that we encourage the community to do, yard signs is a good way to reach outside of your normal circle. All of us have a normal circle of contacts and friends and family, but the yard signs kind of get you beyond that to people you don't normally meet. Because I know a lot of folks feel like, well, how can you not know what's going on? Well, we're all busy. We all have busy lives, and you don't always have those certain circles that are tapped into this stuff. And most people don't even like paying attention to politics in Washington, and they would have no clue who their county board supervisor is or who their city council person is. So it's a good way to get the word out into the community and get people asking more questions. We've used a lot of Facebook, websites, social media. I've done YouTube videos for certain communities, explaining our experience, talking about the questions to ask. So these are extremely effective, again, widening that circle, getting the word out. And actually, one of the town chairmen actually said that what she was reading on Facebook really gave her a lot to go on her own and do her own research and figure out the answers to some of the questions that the community members had. Engaging respected community members, former mayors, the police chief, the local business owners, whoever you can get to engage in your quest for more information, that will be to your advantage. We've held informational forums. I went down and spoke on a biogas panel in southeastern Minnesota, along with a couple other folks, to get information out to people, and then they can decide how they want to question that and apply it to their own life and their own experience and engage their community members and their elected officials. So the things that we tell folks to really check on is their local comprehensive plan. Wisconsin is, I'm sure other states are probably similar, but each city, township, village, whatever, county has a comprehensive plan, which is their version of what the community is like, or what they want it to be, and what it is, what they want it to be, where certain businesses can locate, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some usually very good nuggets in a comprehensive plan that you can utilize to justify your concerns. Also, check about your local water quality and quantity info. Now, Wisconsin DNR does a really good job of putting all this stuff out online. And it's very easy to find out what the nitrate levels in this village of Roberts was. It's back to the 1970s. It was the data that you can base your concerns on. And so it's very, very easy to get in Wisconsin. And I've had the good experience in Minnesota and in Tennessee of, getting even impaired waters list. That's, EPA type stuff. So those are the types of info you would like to have in your arsenal to base some of your questions and concerns on. Municipal wellhead protection area, that is usually the area right around a municipal well where they don't allow certain kinds of businesses there because it is a threat to the drinking water for the community. And so in the village of Roberts, Nature Energy, when they were siting their facility, they picked an area inside that municipal wellhead protection area. And this is a manure processing and storage facility. It's like that should never have gone there. There was ordinances against that, and they were asking for a waiver. So yeah, there's certain areas that are totally off limits to these types of facilities because of the threat to groundwater and drinking water. We also had checked the violation history of Vanguard Renewables out east. They were in Massachusetts and Vermont, and they had 50 violations just on the hydrogen sulfide in the last 3 years of going over their limits out east. And so when folks and local officials have that kind of information, that gives them pause and makes them realize that maybe we need to start asking more questions. We need some more accountability. We could have, you'll hear later about what you can do at the state house and local level with ordinances. Another good folks to ask questions of is your local highway guys, the people who build the roads. This is a lot of truck traffic. What's going to happen to your roads? How are you going to pay for them to get repaired? and even emergency services, EMS, the fire department in particular, because the stacks for a lot of these facilities are a lot taller than the ladders on the trucks that your local fire department may have. And so those are the type of folks you want to get them to weigh in on the situation as well. Other local businesses that could be potentially affected. I mean, some of these facilities, like the one in Pelham, Tennessee, was like within a mile of the school. It was also within a mile of a huge tourist draw called the Caverns, which folks would come in, go down into the cave, have a big concert. You know, it was a very well-respected business that was going to suffer greatly because of the smell or the traffic or other concerns there. And so we always tell folks to get the local people, local business people around you engaged and ask them what are their concerns, how this would affect their business. And lastly, I talk about paid trips to Europe to see their facilities in Europe. In the village of Roberts, actually Nature Energy paid for a couple of the board members and a staff person to fly to Denmark and view the facilities in Denmark. In the village of Ellsworth, the village actually paid for 2 of their village board members and a staff person to fly over to Denmark. But again, that's Europe's very different in their regulations and their placements and their sightings than we are here in America. And so that's not really an apples to apples comparison. So, but look for that, look for any other signs that you can tell that if someone's being wooed inappropriately, especially with finance. And so, this is a very high level of the types of things that we've utilized and knew to check in the past that have brought forth questions that they have a hard time answering. And if they can't come back with acceptable answers, then that gives the community a pretty good idea as to whether or not they want a facility like this. And it's usually no, thank you. And so out of the 10 that I've been a part of, other than Emerald, 9 of them have turned it down. And so it's been, when communities find out what it's really involved in and really entails, they have a lot of questions and a lot of unanswered issues. So that's been my experience.
Wow, thank you so much, Kim. This is such a valuable playbook that you've put together, and with a track record of defeating 9 of 10 digester projects, just shows you're one to listen to on this. So thank you so much for sharing all of this valuable information. And I meant to mention in the beginning that if folks have questions, feel free, you can put them in the chat. We also have the Q&A function available. We're going to go to our next speaker now, but we'll have plenty of time at the end for any questions that folks have for Kim or our other panelists. So next we're going to turn to Samantha Krop, who has something to teach us about what happens when a digester project actually is installed, but then fails. Samantha is the Neuse Riverkeeper and Sound River's Director of Advocacy, monitoring the health of the Neuse and its many tributaries in North Carolina. Sam came to Sound Rivers from Oregon, where she served as the coalition coordinator for the Forest Waters Coalition, a network of conservationists and community members working together to create stronger protections for Oregon's forested watersheds. Before her full-time role as a coalition builder, she taught undergraduate and graduate level courses in environmental justice and pedagogy at the University of Oregon. So Samantha, we know that North Carolina's pork industry, and now some chickens too, have been implementing digesters over the past several years. And some of us, I think, are familiar with the one site of White Oak Farms that had a catastrophic explosion. Tell us more about what's happening on the ground in North Carolina and what you've learned through your research and through your work as a waterkeeper there.
Thank you, Chloe, so much. And thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. As Chloe mentioned, I work as the Neuse Riverkeeper here in southeastern North Carolina. And I've been tasked today with the role of sharing somewhat of a horror story from my investigative work on smoked biogas here in North Carolina. As a riverkeeper, I'm a bit of a part scientist, part investigator, part educator, part advocate. And we do, run a hotline and have a monitoring program where we end up learning about a lot of issues as they come up in our watershed. And of course, a primary source of water quality pollution here in North Carolina is swine CAFOs. We are the second largest producer of pork in the country. And in just the past handful of years, really, we've become, a leader in the swine biogas industry. To give you an idea, Smithfield Foods, which is, our massive corporation, the largest pork producer out here, reported that essentially their plan is by 2030 to have 90% of its hog farms feeding into biogas pipelines. So we're looking in the middle of some pretty significant biogas expansions. And as you can imagine, this has become a pretty big part of my work as a riverkeeper, sort of tracking the impacts of these. And part of the way that we do that, aside from doing sort of our monitoring of land and waterways, is we also partner with a nonprofit named South Wings, shout out to South Wings, who connect us with volunteer pilots to get up in the tiny little single engine Cessna planes and fly over the watershed to get a look at things that we just can't see from the ground. And this is how one of those routine monitoring flights was how I initially discovered what I soon learned was a significant environmental disaster that had happened on the ground at one of these biogas facilities named White Oak Farms. And that facility is in Fremont, North Carolina, which is in Wayne County in the Neuse watershed. And I want to share a little bit about sort of how we discovered that and all this pretty rich story behind it and some of the takeaway lessons. And I am going to share my screen because I have some photos here. So can everyone just get like a thumbs up if you can see this photo?
Looking good.
Great, thank you. So this is a photo of what I saw when I flew over the White Oak Farms facility site on August 3rd, 2022. What I noticed immediately, and what many of you might notice looking at this if you're familiar with how biogas operations operate, is that the cover on the covered lagoons was flat. There was some water pooling on top. I also noticed that the surrounding area, the berm surrounding the lagoon, had been disturbed. There had been a lot of land clearing, land moving around that area. So that was a red flag for me. And an immediate next step is we do what riverkeepers do, which is we dig. We dig into the paperwork database of DEQ to see what the heck is going on. And in that digging, what we uncovered was a story of how 3 million gallons of hog waste, swine carcass, and expired meat ended up erupting from this covered lagoon and spilling into nearby wetlands and a water of the United States called Nahunta Swamp. And this was months before I flew over and saw this for myself. So this was an environmental disaster that occurred months before. And this sort of really terrible science experiment, as it sort of infamously became known, thanks to this headline from the News and Observer, a quote from one of my colleagues who worked on this case very closely with me, is sort of an example of a worst case scenario of what can go wrong with unregulated, unresearched experimental biogas. So I want to spend some time really digging into the history here. In order to understand this disaster, we have to look at how this facility got to this place. So rewinding back to the 90s, a long time ago, the Balances, who are the owners of White Oak, they first started operating a typical swine CAFO. They were permitted to have 5,500 sows on site. But later in the early 2000s, they were looking to expand. But there was an issue because of a 2007 moratorium in North Carolina that we have on swine expansion, thanks to the amazing work of a lot of environmentalists, environmental justice advocates here. That moratorium disallowed the prevention or disallowed the expansion of CAFOs, of swine CAFOs. And so they were kind of stuck. However, the Balances found a loophole in North Carolina's 2007 Renewable Energy and Efficiency Portfolio Standard, which was an act that supported renewable energy, but it required that 0.2% of North Carolina's renewable energy come from swine waste. And in that piece was how they were able to gain permission from DEQ to expand their operation to 60,000 hogs from that 5,500 number, if and only if they install an anaerobic digester, which is what they did. So I should note that this 8.7 million gallon anaerobic digester that was installed was earthen lined, despite the fact that North Carolina has rules requiring that any expansion of a lagoon has to have a synthetic liner to prevent groundwater contamination. They moved forward with this earthen-lined digester. And over the following years since that time when they started operation of that digester, there were several documented issues on site. So DEQ's records indicated a small spill in 2018 from a clogged pipe, a slew of failure to keep records, inadequate record keeping, inadequate notes on sludge levels, sludge surveys, kind of a mess of lack of record keeping in that time. And yet, fast forward to 2020, the DEQ approved an update to the biogas permit. So instead of simply allowing typical utilization of swine waste for the generation of methane, the new permit allowed for up to 20,000 pounds of food waste like hot dogs or deli meat and 210,000 pounds of dead pigs, or what they call in the industry liquefied pig. I learned, sorry for sharing that, but had to share that. And so all of that got to be added now into this anaerobic digester. And during the same time, the COVID pandemic hit. And despite the fact that the farm was permitted to have the 60,000 hogs on site, they only had around 100. And by 2021, they only had 50 hogs on site. So what ended up happening was between that period in 2021, essentially the manure-based waste stream changed over to a mortality-dominated waste stream. So instead of generating methane from manure, they were mostly generating it from, LP, liquefied pig, and expired hot dog waste. And this is important. So during this time, that change resulted in a change in the energy output. They actually noticed that it increased the methane production, and from an energy production standpoint, the facility experienced its best period to date. However, during the same period, the wastewater characteristics changed. Ammonia, copper, zinc showed noteworthy increases. And that's probably due to the higher solid content of the waste inputs. So that's important. So all of this is the backdrop. This report, this 2021 report, noting that change in energy and that change in wastewater characteristics really came just days before the DEQ got on site and found in January 2022 an unreported spill. Now, this was a routine investigation that they were doing, and what they found was a spill of oozing, this is not my language, oozing waste foam that had been coming out from underneath the digester cover. So at this point in January 2022, and the facility operators attempted to cover this up with hay. And so DEQ noted that this was, they, tried to be covered up. They issued an NOV, and the facility continued to operate business as usual. And then 4 months later, on May 30th, 2022, the facility reported, and I should note this was in the middle of the night, the facility reported a failure of the digester cover resulting in the discharge of what I said in the beginning, 3 million gallons of that slurry of, hog waste, deli meat, liquefied pig. And that, contacted wetlands and contacted that water of the United States, Nahunta Swamp. That spill continued on for weeks, and by the time it was stopped, at least 37,000 gallons had reached wetlands, and more than 4 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of waste had been spilled, to give you a little image of that. And I want to reiterate that, at the time we discovered this via flying over, no fine had been issued at that time. And we only found out about this because of chance, because we were doing a monitoring flight and saw this and then did our digging. And despite the fact that North Carolina law says that 15,000 gallons, if 15,000 gallons of a spill meets surface waters, you have to put it in the newspaper. There was only a teeny little press release sent out that we were able to dig up later. So this was truly unknown to the world, despite the significance of this spill. And so at that point, I'm behind on my slides. Sorry, I should have trigger warninged with the disgustingness of these slides, but this is what the DEQ, this is DEQ images. This is what they were looking at. This is the foam that, slurry that spilled. And what I want to do now is just spend a minute or two talking about sort of how we responded as river keepers. So discovering all of this, we decided that what should we do? We should go out and we should do our own sampling. So we went on a pretty outrageous adventure down Nahunta Swamp. I included some photos of us dragging kayaks, and one of the most wild sort of backcountry field experiences that I've had in this work. But we did this on 4 separate occasions to do water quality sampling in the Nahunta Swamp Creek and the channels draining off of this biogas facility. And no surprise, what we found was that extremely elevated levels of fecal bacteria and nutrients were running off of this facility, both via surface water channels and by tile drains. And so, you know, for you nerds out there, we're talking E. coli levels like 1,900 MPN or off the charts. And then, you know, TKN at 30 milligrams a liter, nitrogen, nitrate at 15 milligrams per liter. This is, you know, very significant. So we, Sound River, sent numerous letters to DEQ. We engaged them in the conversation. We, of course, you know, scurried up a bunch of news media on this to get public attention and awareness on this. And the result was that in the end of 2022, DEQ issued one of the largest civil penalties of the year for water quality violations at $34,000 to this facility. Basically for, you know, for the discharge and for all of their failures to record keep and do their monitoring and to essentially do what they were required to do as operators of this facility. And most recently, the outcome of all of our water quality sampling that over the course of 2022 and 2023 indicated that this discharge was still occurring. Most recently, in November of last year, the DEQ actually issued another NOV saying that not only are they not going to renew their permit for these lagoons, thankfully, but that they need to close out these lagoons. So they are required now to formally close the damaged lagoons and get them off the landscape. So the hitch and the way that I will end this is that unfortunately, the facility operators are, you know, unable to come up with the money to do the closure. So these lagoons are, while they're not operating now, and while there are no swine on site, they continue to sit on the landscape. And they continue to pollute Nahunta Swamp, which feeds into Contentnea Creek, which feeds into the Neuse River downstream. And so until they can come up with the money to close these out, this continues to be sort of a scourge in the Neuse watershed. And we'll continue to work on this. So I will leave it there. Yeah, happy to answer questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Sam. I knew about that case, but I didn't know how it was discovered. I didn't know that it took so long to discover it and that was a result of your all's flyover. So glad that you did that. Before we go on to Keith, I'll just add one quick story, which is that when Friends of the Earth and SRAP were meeting with USDA's research mission area recently to share some of the results of our recent report where we highlighted the White Oak Farms explosion as a case study in our report. At the end, one of the researchers said, well, you know, we have teams that are working on making biogas as safe and as effective as it can possibly be. We have this team in South Carolina that's been working on this. And in fact, their research was what led to an update in North Carolina's law, the update that you were talking about, Sam, that actually allowed White Oak Farms to get this exemption on the basis of having a digester and implementing these best practices. This researcher was touting it as, you know, so yeah, USDA is doing all of this great work about it. And Chris was in that meeting with me, Chris Hunt from SRAP, and he immediately could tell what I was going to do because a huge smile came over my face as I got to giddily tell the research department that in fact, this was not a shining example of biogas technology working, and it was the exact opposite. And I think demonstrates the opposite, which is that, you know, even these technologies that on paper can sound really good, when it comes to the scale that these projects are and the lack of regulation in the environment that they're going into, there is no safe way to implement a manure digester. So with that, we're going to go over to our next panelist, Keith. Keith Schneider is based in Michigan. He has reported on the contest for energy, food, and water in the era of climate change from 6 continents. Keith, we know you've been writing about animal agriculture's impact on human and environmental health, and that's led you to biogas. So tell us, what have you learned through your research and reporting?
Well, thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here. Commend SRAP's work on this. Here in Michigan, we have 2 great HAFO antagonists, one of whom works for you, right? Lynn Henning, Goldman Award winner, and Pam Taylor. I met them in 2022 when I started my work on farm nutrient pollution. Pam is the winner of the Petoskey Award, which is Michigan's top environmental prize. There's a lot I want to say. The most important thing that I can say is that in the nearly 3 years that I've been tracking this around the country, particularly in the Great Lakes region and in the Corn Belt, is that we have an opportunity to change or require the EPA to update the Clean Water Act around biodigesters. Biodigesters regulated on an agricultural operation are essentially unregulated in every state that I've looked at. The same piece of equipment installed on a wastewater treatment plant, food processing plant, or any other major source of the kinds of waste that are applicable to be put into a biodigester are heavily regulated. So a biodigester installed on a wastewater treatment plant here in Michigan, for instance, digestate is very heavily regulated. You have to go back and put it back through the system to treat it. The land application, the biosolids are very heavily regulated about where they go, how much you can put on, how much you have to regulate the water and test the water around it. Very heavily regulated. On an agriculture operations, essentially nothing. And this is happening in Iowa, Nebraska, and other states. So my message to activists and my friends in the legal community is, I mean, this may be a tough message to SRAP because this does cement, biodigestion as a part of the infrastructure of industrial agriculture. But if it's coming, then we have a chance, I think, to make the case that it's a point source, an industrial point source to regulate, which itself may add to the cost, which itself may prompt the oil, chemical, oil, government, ag triumvirate that's building this stuff to change how they're doing it. One more piece about that. Here in Michigan, Chevron is one of the big players, right? Chevron has built 5 biodigesters. Two farms that are attached to a Chevron Brightmark biodigester south of me, about 100 miles, will be treating their digestate in the Muskegon wastewater treatment plant. Now, how are they doing that? The state has spent $60 million to help finance a $17 million waste pipeline from some food processors in the center of the state. And these 2 farms and that biodigester are going to tie into this wastewater pipeline, taking it to the Muskegon wastewater treatment plant, where they will spend $1,000 a day to get it treated, which means that there's an opportunity to treat this waste in a way that's responsible, socially responsible, ecologically responsible. I think it's the only one on an ag operation that does this, that's going to do this. That's my big message here. Now let me go into my sort of background with your permission. So I began this project looking at phosphorus in Lake Erie, and much of that phosphorus, and there's the differences about how much of it is CAFO related, but a good bit of it, say half, maybe 70%, which is producing these huge harmful algal blooms, not only in Lake Erie, but in Chesapeake Bay and many iconic waters, Lake Okeechobee, Lake Champlain, you can name others. The Mississippi River, the great, dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And that led me to nitrates, which is a worse problem in the Corn Belt. It's just worse, it's much worse. And this is what I call a national scandal. It's a national scandal. Agriculture now is the largest polluter in the history of any industrial sector in US history, period. It produces more water pollution, it produces more air pollution, and it's the largest source, says this EPA, although EDF's MethSat may change this. EPA says it's the largest source of methane into the atmosphere of any industry in the country. It is a scandal. Why is it such a scandal? Because it's not essentially regulated, right? The Clean Water Act, 1972, the writers and policymakers that established the Clean Water Act immunized agriculture, just immunized. You can put as much fertilizer, as much chemicals on the land, and what they do for CAFOs, they call it nutrient management plans, which essentially don't work, and we know they don't work because the practices that the USDA and Congress decided to put in place to try to control this pollution doesn't work. Best management practices don't work. I just did a piece, y'all can look at it, type in toxic terrain, Keith Schneider, you'll see it. Just produced a piece that says we spent $30 billion in the Mississippi Basin states since they started the work to try to control the dead zone. at the mouth of the Mississippi or near the mouth of the Mississippi, $30 billion on conservation practices, best management practices. Now they work, if you put them in place for 10 years or 15 years, they can work individually, but not enough farmers are interested in it for lots of reasons, and they're not working. And we know that. Nitrate pollution is increasing in groundwater and in surface water in every state in the country where there's major CAFOs and where there's major corn, which is the Corn Belt, the most heavily fertilized crop. Secondly, Congress and the Biden administration decided with the infrastructure law and with the Inflation Reduction Act to make this worse, right? Why did they going to make this work? Because they've decided that agriculture, corn, ethanol, and CAFOs, manure for methane, is they're driving agriculture closer and closer to the center of US energy production. That's why the oil industry and the ag industry and government have come together around biodigesters. And the government, since 1993 under Clinton, had been promoting this technology and promoting this practice in order to treat waste from CAFO since 1993. Michigan, I learned, is the second most active industrial biodigester development state in the country outside of California. And this new development, these are $20 million machines that are being installed here, 5 by Chevron, and an equal number, almost an equal number, by a group called South Jersey Industries, SJI. They're a New Jersey-based natural gas producer, natural gas processor, natural gas pipeline shipper that's come here to build these huge biodigestion operations on our dairy farms on the Lake Huron side, the east side of the state. And Chevron has got the west side of the state. So many of our largest dairies are now equipped with these biodigesters. And it is just, it's gonna produce a mess. It's gonna produce a mess because that digestate is more concentrated phosphorus, more concentrated nitrogen, more available, more ecologically available for plants, and more mobile in the environment into the water. Now, if you study this stuff, you'll learn that the plants only take up a small portion of phosphorus and nitrogen. You know, up to 70% of nitrogen, nitrates that get into the field run off. Or if they don't run off, they're drained into a system called tiling. So much of the land, the agricultural cropland in this part of the country is drained by a network called tiling. And essentially they're perforated pipes that have been installed under the crops that act like, they act like vacuum cleaners. And so anything that comes on the surface is sucked into these tilings and drained into our ditches, which go to our streams, which go to our river. And best management practices are not working at all to stem that pollution. So the last piece that I can just say about this is, we face, if this is not stopped or at least halted, a more mammoth pollution problem in which our government leaders, big ag and oil industry is going to tell us, oh, we have a solution to that. We can solve that with, buffer zones and cover crops and planting this and that and, changing our ditching systems. And we can solve that with best management practices. And I call that the most expensive, ineffective pollution prevention program ever devised in the history of the world.
Wow, that was powerful, Keith. There are some powerful quotes in there. And yeah, I think people just don't realize, the people in this room do, but policymakers do not realize the kind of scam that is the lack of regulation of industrial animal ag and all the forms of pollution that we're enduring from it.
Can I add one more piece?
Yeah.
Just very quickly. When the IRA was passed, it is the most significant change in agricultural production, strategy that we've had since Earl Butz, said plant fence row to fence row, right? It is the most significant change, which has the most profound implications for the climate and for water pollution and for people's health, right? In, 50 years, nobody said hey, this is a really important change in federal environmental policy. We should do an EIS. We should at least do an environmental assessment. Nothing. There was nothing. And the environmental community, I don't know what SRAP said about this, but I have a dear, dear friend at the top of the NRDC, Natural Resource Defense Council, who I talked about this about a month ago. I had no idea all this was happening. And I said to him, I'm not going to say his name because I don't want to embarrass him. I said to him, dude, we're facing an amazing change and potentially terrifying, perilous change in ecological sustainability of America right now over this policy. And none of you guys took a look at it and said, hey, we ought to evaluate what this means for the environment. So there's another piece that I've been advocating, with my friends in the environmental community and in the legal community. Food and Water Watch is great on this. SRAP is doing tremendous work on this. There are some others. Lisa Dorr is on this call. She's amazing. Pam is on this call. She's amazing. But that's what we need to do. We need to organize about a response, a regulatory response, a political response that says, wait a second. We're about to pollute the hell out of this country more than it already is by the worst polluters that have been in the United States. Let's at least look at an EIS on this and get a plan for how to deal with it. Agriculture is not, 80 acres and 20 cows anymore. It's 10,000 acres and 1,000 cows or 10,000 hogs. These are really, really sophisticated operations that produce an amazing amount of food and fiber and all the rest, ethanol, fuel, energy, whatever. They can handle the cost of the changes in management of their incredibly mammoth, colossal waste stream. And we ought to be demanding that. We ought to be demanding it and doing the same things that Pam just said at the national level. Bringing the information, making the case.
Well, I'm with you, Keith. And another person who's with you and is doing that exact work at the national level is our next speaker, Patty Lovera. She is the policy advisor for the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment, which includes some of the groups that you just mentioned. It's a coalition of state and national groups working to fight factory farms. Before her current role, Patty was the policy director at the Organic Farmers Association and served as Food and Water Watch's program director for 14 years. She holds a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Lehigh University and a master's degree in environmental policy from the University of Michigan. Preceding her time at Food and Water Watch, Patty was the deputy director of energy and environment at Public Citizen and worked as a researcher at the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice. Patty, over to you to tell us, you're fighting the good fight. Tell us how it's going in Congress.
Sure. Hey, everybody. Happy to chat about this infuriating topic. So we've heard a ton of good stuff. So I just have kind of a couple of things maybe that round out the conversation about why this topic is so infuriating. So I work with a coalition of groups from state-based groups from the Midwest, some national groups. And what we have in common is that we don't like factory farms. And we have an analysis where we really think that we need to deal with the factory farms system. There's a bunch of reasons we have factory farms. It's not because we're unlucky. It's not because they make sense. We have a lot of policy and economic and power decisions that have given us this system. And unfortunately, digesters, especially this current new wave pushing digesters and factory farm gas, is unfortunately making that possibly entrenching that system. And we think it's one way to think about this industry, in addition to the individual fights we have to have community by community to try to block them. So there's lots of things that prop up the factory farm system, our farm policy and corn and soy that are the animal feed, not enforcing environmental rules, the buyers of the product, the meat or milk processors as they got bigger. CAFOs got bigger to supply them, but increasingly in the last decade, we see this additional factor, which is a stupid amount of investment in this particular piece of digesters. And we really have to, one, call that out, because a lot of it is public money that could be doing something else. And it's an investment in a terrible system, and it might be a real waste of money. We're kind of stranding this money in a system that we should be radically overhauling. So just a couple of things I want to just offer up, and then get to questions. We heard from Kim, the technology of digesters has been around for a while. And, there's been kind of waves of interest, and then the bubble bursts a little bit and then it comes back. We're definitely in a potential boom right now. There's a tremendous amount of hype and a tremendous amount of investment in a newer generation of this. And I think it's worth talking about some of the characteristics of this new generation of the technology. And this isn't true everywhere in the country. There's different flavors based on, what animal you're talking about, where you are in the country. But we're seeing more and more of these very large digester sites that would serve multiple factory farms feeding into it. And that's notable for a couple of reasons. One is you got to move the manure to the digester, and then you have to move the gas somewhere where it's going to be used. And that's extra infrastructure. In addition to the footprint we already have and the worries about, what's happening at the actual lagoon. Is the cover going to hold? Is the lagoon going to leak, like we heard about in North Carolina? If you're then moving manure to some central digester that's off-site, and then the gas has to get somewhere where it's going to be used. Sometimes it's used on site, but a lot of times it's not. So then now we're having pipeline conversations in addition to the digester conversation. And some of our folks in CFFE in Minnesota are even hearing about trucking the gas in lieu of a pipeline, which is yet another layer of outrage and possible, possible catastrophe if you're thinking about moving this gas in pressurized trucks on a highway. So we just have to start kind of calling out like the levels of absurdity. If this is a supposed fix to our, factory farm manure problem, and if this much money and effort is available, that's a fix. Let's find a better one than dumping, more good money after bad. And then one other thing I will flag is this increasingly, if we're thinking about the factory farm system and the role that digesters might play in it, is these machines and these facilities are not for small farms. They are for large operations. There's a minimum amount of waste you need. It needs to be available all the time where the digester doesn't work properly. But the hype is very much about how this is this transformative source of income for struggling farm economies. And we need to all start pulling that apart as a myth about who is going to benefit. It is often energy companies, not actual folks involved in agriculture. And even if there is money that would make it back to the owner of those animals who are generating that manure, we have to be very clear about what scale and what type of farms are going to be able to get into these programs. It is not small farms. And if this is one more thing that takes us away from, policy and healthy markets that pay people for what they grow and what they produce, and instead you're supposed to make your money from all these other ways. Now you're supposed to make your money from your biogas payment. It doesn't matter what milk prices are. That may work for big guys, but it's not going to work for small farms that have to make it on the milk price. So we need to just call out yet another myth around this industry that it is not going to save small or mid-sized farms. This is technology and very financialized arrangements that is for the biggest players. So super quickly, in DC and in lots of policy circles and state capitals, the hype machine around digesters and factory farm gas is unbelievable. And it's really mostly bullshit, right? There's just a lot of greenwashing going on in no particular order. And this is an incomplete list. Some of the nonsense that is being spewed about this technology and how it will save us all include that it somehow makes the waste go away. And we know that's not true. We've heard from speakers today. There is still waste to be dealt with, and we are not, in most places, it's not being dealt with appropriately. There is still digestate and water that has to be dealt with. The waste just doesn't magically vaporize and go away because there's a digester, but you wouldn't know that from a lot of the conversations happening in policy circles and in industry hype. We talked about, like this, I talked about the centralized proposals that are even bigger. These are really industrial facilities, and this is not something piece of machinery you just see on a farm. This is big, complex, and potentially dangerous, and communities are not fully ready for what this might mean to have something on the edge of town that's this complicated and potentially this explosive. So there's an entire emergency response infrastructure piece that we need to be calling out, and that is not part of the conversation. And I think the last piece that we can really pull apart is that this really is very, very, very speculative. It really feels like a bubble. There's a tremendous amount of hype. There is a tremendous amount of other people's money being used to build these things. And if some of those conditions change, it really could fall apart. And then, we already heard from Kim earlier about like, they built these things, it exploded, they stopped using it. So we need to talk about, just really call out some of the hype and some of the greenwashing that's happening. And one of the key pieces of calling that out is really talking about the money. These facilities don't want to pay for these things themselves. They want to use other people's money to do it. So a quick list of the places that are contributing money to this that is not the backers of the projects. They're not putting their own money out there, getting it from elsewhere. So a quick list, depending on where you live, there could be tweaks, but places you could look for that it is openly discussed at digester conferences about like getting your project paid for. California is paying for a lot of this. We are building digesters around the country because of a California specific program called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which prioritizes manure-based biogas over other actual renewable sources of energy. And projects around the country are getting money to be built that from dollars that are generated from California. We already heard North Carolina had a preference in their state green energy program. The official titles in a lot of states is the Renewable Portfolio Standard. You might have a preference in your state in a green energy goal for this kind of energy. Some states are putting this in their state climate response plans. And then this industry is real good at getting local governments to cough up money. So you do have to look at that in terms of like tax abatements, economic development grants, free stuff, free roads, free water, free everything, free emergency response. And in some cases, demanding that local governments put up cash to build pipelines to move either the manure or the gas from a pipeline. And then the list of federal money, I'll just do really quickly. There are folks on this call who can help with that if you want to look at it. There's multiple pots of money. Keith just referenced the Inflation Reduction Act. So we have conservation and energy programs in the farm bill that we do every 5 years. And the Inflation Reduction Act took those existing programs and just dumped extra money into them. Two that I'll name. One is the EQIP program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. It's a good program. Many small farms apply every year and get shut out because they run out of money. But digesters can also get grants from that program. And because now the USDA has said, yes, this counts as a climate smart initiative, we're worried that more of that money is going to go to digesters and more small farms who want a smaller grant to do actual sustainable things will be shut out. So we don't need to end EQIP, we need to fix it and say digesters shouldn't be eligible. Another one you may hear about is REAP, which is the Rural Energy for America program. And again, it's an existing program. It does a lot of good stuff. It puts a lot of solar panels on farms. It buys higher efficiency equipment for grain drying. It does lots of useful things, but it also writes $1 million checks for one digester. That because of this Inflation Reduction Act infusion of money and because digesters have been deemed climate smart. So there's other ways the government is promoting this, including just flat out promoting the technology through a program called AgStar. But I think, and we can do more questions. There's resources out there if people want to look to see if the project they're dealing with has gotten these grants. But it is, I think, a moment for us as folks who are working on this all around the country to take on the myths and the hype that this industry has used pretty successfully so far to say on the ground, this is not a solution. You're making the problem worse, and stop dumping these huge amounts of money into this. You have that much money available. Think what we could do instead to transition CAFOs into something better, to do real renewable energy. So that's, I think, a useful thing we can do together is think about how do we take on their mythology and frame what a real investment in real solutions would look like. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Patty. And yeah, I think Allie's comment in the chat captures this well. The opportunity cost, like what else could we be doing with these massive volumes of money? It's huge. We all can think of way better uses for this money when it comes to true conservation and renewable energy. So we have a little less than 15 minutes left for the Q&A portion here. So thank you to those who've been submitting comments via the Q&A function. You can also put your comments in the chat. Kim, we have a question for you. You mentioned when the folks came in to do the Emerald project that all their marketing said, this will make all your problems go away. And, you know, this is, it's all good, nothing to worry about here. Tell us give us the update of where that community is now. What has happened with that digester? What has the community experienced?
Well, the digester only lasted a couple of years. The dairy itself, I mean, everything was built from the ground up. This wasn't a century farm. You know, over time, phosphorus levels can build up in the soil at a century farm. Usually they solve that with crop rotation, a lot of the alfalfa and stuff. But that wasn't really done as much there. And so the big question is, how did the phosphorus levels get so high around the immediate facility where they're pushing 200 parts per million? And at 200 parts per million, the DNR says, no, you can't spread here anymore. You have to find other fields. And so, and a lot of folks have also seen their nitrates rise in their groundwater. We had a lady who ran a daycare service, and she was very religious about testing her water every year. And so she has watched them rise over time since about 2006 or 7. And so they're still struggling there. They're still having a hard time finding clean water at times. One person said they talked to 3 well drillers, and they all said, well, I'll dig you a well. I can't promise you any good water here.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are still people who build houses, and the state will tell you, well, we think you should dig this deep. Well, that's pretty expensive, you know, and a lot of people don't do that, and then come to find out their water doesn't last. You know, they end up having some problems with it, especially at certain times of the year. So there's still a lot of struggles going on in that community. And now the DNR has just approved to double the size of that dairy in that community. And there's 90 families within a 2-mile radius of that community. And it's like, we tried to make sense of this and try to reason and rationale with the DNR that this is not a good place to double the size of this dairy, but they didn't act upon any of our concerns. There was no new permit terms, no nothing. So that community is still struggling.
Wow. 20 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And you know one of the things that you said that struck me is that it ended up shutting down after a few years anyway. And when you think about that in combination with what Patty shared, is about how expensive these investments are, it really casts doubt on the return on investment that taxpayers, you know, are getting with these things. And we found the same thing in the research that Friends of the Earth and SRAP did. We found that 22% of the digesters that were listed in EPA's database were no longer operational. So they have a 1 in 4 chance of shutting down because they're so expensive and complicated to operate, just adding to one more reason that they're not an appealing solution.
Right. And it seems like there's plenty of money to build them, but there's no money to repair them when they do have problems.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because a lot of those programs that Patty mentioned, will subsidize some of the capital costs associated with them at the beginning of the projects. But yeah, what if they need a repair? What about the ongoing maintenance? So thanks for raising that.
Yeah.
So you all have mentioned that, acknowledge sort of that these digesters are having a moment right now among policymakers. I think there's an intuitive appeal that we can all acknowledge, that the idea of, oh, we can, you know, take this capture this methane that would have gone into the atmosphere, redirect it toward biogas, and, you know, solve a lot of our problems. As you all have been interacting with policymakers on this issue, what do you find to be the most compelling arguments, the most compelling points that are really resonating with them to start to cast some doubt on this trend?
Well, one fun fact in all of this is that of the total volume of methane produced by a CAFO, right, a large livestock operation, only 30% of it comes from the manure. 70% of it comes from burping and farting. And the technology and science of how to deal with that is in its infancy. They're starting to talk about it. So as a methane solution for climate, it's minuscule. It's nonsensical. We're spending a lot of money basically to secure taxpayer-based funding, billions, for industrial operations with scant economic returns to the actual farm. And if you look at Aaron Smith's stuff at UCD, University of California, Davis, he's done, I found, the best work on sort of the money piece of this, the financing piece of it. Yeah, a cow is worth X, $1,100, but the biodigester is so expensive. And what, the methane produced by an average cow is like $40 a year or something, I mean, I'm not quoting his stuff accurately, but it's those kinds of numbers. So, as I say, I think if we could get the things regulated properly, we could make a big difference in how they're operating and the way that they're going to be operated. They're publicly funded. The public ought to demand and be able to achieve, a sustainable return.
Any other panelists want to add on to the sort of arguments that have resonated most with their local or national policymakers on this?
I'm happy to add in a little bit. Here in North Carolina, we unfortunately do not have a very, environmentally friendly legislature right now. And so the hooks, even the examples of such a significant environmental disaster like White Oak Farms are, it's hard to gain traction with that. But I do think that what Keith was saying about, the efficiency angle is really helpful. Something that I didn't highlight in the White Oak example was that initially it was, suggested that they may be able to power, I think it was like 2,000 homes. But in the years that they were operating their methane generator, they only ever got enough power for, I think it was like 200 to 400 homes. And so I think if we're looking at this from an energy efficiency and energy production standpoint, rather than an environmental standpoint here in North Carolina, that piece ends up being really helpful. And I think the other thing that comes up is sort of that I have gained some traction on in conversation is just the lack of enforcement capacity from our state regulators. I mean, this example that I shared had, there was a history of red flags leading up to this massive disaster, that if we had regulators who were doing their jobs and had capacity to do their jobs, if we had a system in place, like a 3 strikes you're out system, they would have been out a long time ago. And we also have, no funding in place for if and when disasters do occur. And so I've, gained a little bit of traction around those conversations around funding safety nets, around energy efficiency, and the lack of regulatory capacity.
Yeah,
Great.
Chloe, I'll just add I think all of those are important. And I think especially with folks in Congress, they are being flown to, I think somebody mentioned, and then they got flown to Europe to see this very like modern, fancy, small, food waste. And so I think it's actually a shock to a lot of offices to hear that somebody doesn't like these things, because they really haven't heard much about them except the hype. So just any conversation to say, I am from a community, we don't want it, this is why, is worth having, because they actually aren't hearing that much except these fake conversations about it's all upside. And then I think, this scale is different. The industrial nature is different, how they aren't willing to pay for it themselves. And we've had a little bit, and I'll put it in the chat, we've had a little bit of a moment. I think we're building some momentum to talk about, you're putting enormous amounts of money on the table from the Farm Bill, from the Inflation Reduction Act. We're not asking you for new money. We're asking you to spend that money more fairly. And, like IATP, Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, has done a nice analysis of, if you took some of this money that we're spending on these factory farm practices and just moved it to these practices we know are real, that smaller farms use, that's not new money. That's just a better distribution. We could do hundreds of grants over here with just one grant for a digester. That appeals to a lot of offices because they can't come up with more money. They've spent a lot of money. So we're talking about, like, let's redistribute this more fairly. And then especially if your project, you can tie to a big energy company, that they're using the farmers as a front, right? They're gonna save this farming community, poor dairy farmers, we're gonna put money in their pocket. No, they're not. So these questions to ask, like the vibe of like, just peeling back the layers in public and asking who actually gets the credit money, who's responsible for the cost, who's getting the money, and anything you can do to air that out takes some of the shine off this like very magical story they're selling.
And there's also the co-digester issue, is that a lot of these digesters now are taking in food waste, slaughterhouse waste, maybe biosolids, municipal waste. Public health and safety can be a winning argument, especially if you have data to back up that your water's already in trouble, which we did in St. Croix County. And especially with the Village of Roberts, their nitrates being at 7 and 8, their city water nitrates were at 7 and 8. And so that has a good message to it. And bringing in those types of things into the digester, basically using manure as a substrate, as a free pass to be able to just spread it without further treatment like Keith was talking about. That's a winning message too.
Right.
You know, I was out, I attended a big biodigester conference at Iowa State University in Ames late last year, which was put on by EPA, USDA, Chevron, and Iowa State. Now, if you recognize Iowa State is you know, a center of the science and technology and engineering that produced industrial agriculture, and Iowa State is to this technology what Los Alamos was to nuclear energy. And I really felt listening to all of the pompous, you know, bullshit about its great potential to change agriculture and change waste and make people money and do so safely. It felt to me, I've been in this game a long, long time. It felt to me like I was sitting in a meeting in 1962 between the Atomic Energy Commission and the American utility industry about the advent of nuclear power. That's what it felt. That's how hyped this conversation is in the places that are making the policy. They're not hearing any kind of chatter in opposition to it in most places. And that's because it's complex stuff and the media is not doing it. And I don't have a lot of people I'm pushing aside to tell these stories, you know?
Wow. Well, we are about at time, and I think that's a very powerful way to wrap up this session. That, you know, we're at this moment where the evidence is clear to us. It's clear to the people in this room that this is not the path. And we're at a time when so much money has been invested into this strategy, and there's so much hype around it. And so I think the combination of, we heard from Kim and Keith about site fights and fighting these individual operations. We heard from Sam about the importance of monitoring and being vigilant, telling these stories and getting this information out here. Heard from Patty and others about the importance of being vigilant and proactive with policymakers, both at the local level and federal level. Kim shared her playbook of, here's all the things to do if you think a digester might be coming to your town. So hopefully this session will equip us with the tools that we need to be able to fight back against this dangerous trend, this marriage of fossil fuels and factory farming and the emergence of factory farm gas. And I'll just close by saying that you all know this already because you're here at an SRAP meeting, but SRAP is in a position to help local communities with these fights. And as Kim was going through some of her checklists, I thought, well, I would have no idea how to find, you know, that plan or figure out that zoning law. Well, I'll tell you who does. Lynn Henning at SRAP can figure it out for you. So we do have, you know, among each other, and especially the SRAP staff, the resources that we need to work together to do this research, to learn between communities, to make sure that we can fight these in all places, and then fight them at the stem by fighting these policies and the incentives and the funding. Yes, Lynn can find anything that's going back to biogas. So with that, I just want to thank our panelists one more time for a great discussion, and to SRAP for giving me the privilege of facilitating it. Back over to you, Sherry.
Thank you so much, Chloe. And you're so right. Lynn is our private investigator. So she can find out any kind of information that we need. And also Eli and you know, the rest of our legal staff have definitely you know, added a lot of power for what we're able to find and what we're able to do with the information once we get it. So thanks for that plug for SRAP's work, because we're getting more and more and more requests around this biogas digester issue every week. And so we know that it's not going away. And we can see very directly that there's a trend here, and they're, as Patty mentioned, they're piling on factory farms to feed these operations, and there's a lot of money that's being made available to go toward them. So we know this fight is, you know, this effort is only going to get larger, I think, for us to be able to help these communities fight back. So.